Hey everyone, Ryan here of Plague Scythe Studios. Welcome back to yet another overdrive-centric episode of Pedalhead. Today's circuit of choice is the critically acclaimed Fulltone OCD version 1.6. I've sort of inadvertently hyped up this video more than I ever intended to. A lot of people have asked about this one since I've mentioned it for the past few months. I've been really wanting to make a content piece about the OCD, but I kept putting it off. There was new products I wanted to cover first, both in terms of my own desires and in terms of kind of sticking with the theme of this, I guess you could call mini season of Pedalhead. And so kept pushing it to the back burner, but here we are today. And again, I kind of regret, putting it on this video on any sort of pedestal, because this is going to be really the bread and butter of this little video show I make. There's really not going to be any major revelations here. And that should be expected. This is, after all, a volume drive tone kind of pedal. How many times have we demoed something like this on this channel? But what I do hope you take away from this, something that I took away, is that looks can be deceiving, both in terms of physical appearance and the circuit design, because yes, this does have a lot of callbacks to, not only clipping diode pedals, but a lot of hard clipping pedals, in terms of circuit similarities and even some tonal similarities when you dial it in a certain way. But it is an extremely different beast in a lot of its range. And for me, this is an invaluable tool if you're someone that likes to have kind of a channel 2 or channel 3 in a pedal form that sounds more like a tube amplifier, or at least a tube gain stage, because this does a really nice job of doing that. So I'm only going to kind of scratch the surface on the circuit design of the OCD, because as I kind of hinted at in the intro, this is version 1.6, and there's 1.1 all the way up to 2.0. There's a germanium diode version of this. Every one of them kind of sounds ever so slightly different. There's some of them that have a little bit larger gain range compared to the one I'm holding. There's some that have just a little bit of a different texture. I don't think any of them really stop sounding like an OCD, but this is one of those pedals that's sort of hard to talk about in absolutes. You kind of just have to hear which one we're demoing at that time and make your decision based on that information. So my experience with the OCD has been relatively limited up until rather recently. This was always one of those pedals where once in a blue moon, you might catch it in a local music shop in the used pedal case, and I might have demoed one 2 or 3 times in my entire life. And it was always a situation where it's not my guitar, it's not my amp, and certainly not my pedal. So kind of gauging where the boundaries between each piece of gear exists, and what tones are kind of baked into the instrument, how much of the overall sound I'm hearing is kind of just the amplifier alone. Is there a weird bright switch, or is the gain structure always kind of this thing? And so deciphering exactly what the OCD did differently from, say, your run-of-the-mill super overdrive or tube screamer wasn't exactly intuitive, and I always thought it was fine, but it never really sounded all that different. Maybe a little bit more full range, maybe a little less compressed in some ways, but it never inspired me to go out and buy one for the price tags that they were going for. Now, fast forward to February of this year, when Onofre from NOF Customs was shipping out my Super Typhoon, and he was like, hey, I got a couple pedals around the shop that either A, I can't get fixed anywhere in the Philippines, so I'm going to send it to you, and if you want to do something with it, cool. I've since had a couple of these repaired. But the pedal he seemed the least excited about was the Fulltone OCD, and he sort of mirrored my attitude, where he kind of confessed that he only played through it a handful of times. It was fine, it functioned, but Was never really inspirational or did anything special for him. So he was basically like, hey, if you want it and you want to make some videos about it, then take it, because I'm just going to kind of flip it anyway. So my initial plan was to just do just that and send it back to him when I had the other pedals repaired. This unfortunately did ended up needing a couple of things fixed once it flew over here. The true bypass foot switch did not make the trip over. But once I got it back in the mail the second time from repair, I was kind of blown away at just how organic, another buzzword for you, but organic and amp-like this pedal sounds. Generally speaking, mid-gain and high-gain tube amplifiers of the British flavor tend to cooperate a little more when it comes to those classic crunch tones and even rock tones, whether you're plugging straight through the amp or using a mild clean boost. And even if you're going for full bore metal sounds, you know, just throw a 20 decibel clean boost, cut a little bit of the low end, boost the mids to taste, and it's probably going to work really well. However, when we're talking about more American style clean channels, or even some of the dirtier channels like Rhythm 2 on this Mesa Boogie, can get a little brittle, and bridging the gap between, you know, where one leaves off and the other one begins in terms of the tonal spectrum, sometimes it helps to have a bit of a dirt box to complete that gap. And the OCD does just that for me. Whether I'm trying to, you know, turn Rhythm 1 on this channel to something that sounds more like a JTM 45, or I want to saturate Rhythm 2 to be more like a JCM 800 kind of sound, or I want to throw this in front of the lead channel and just get a ridiculous amount of high gain, or even pair it with something that's more like a more traditional British amplifier. It pairs extremely well, but this is one of those transparent kind of boosts that melds into gain structures like that, then it doesn't really sound any different than the amp on its own, which is a great thing. That is one of the best use cases of this pedal, in my opinion. It just doesn't stick out as much as something like a Blues Breaker or a Klon or all the other variations thereof that are out there nowadays in that specific spot. But there's plenty of uses where I think this really shines. And in fact, I think this becomes my recommendation over some of those pedals. So let's jump into a little bit of that. While the OCD certainly shares many sonic features with pedals like the Blues Breaker or the Klon, it actually shares many more similarities with pedals that came even further back before it. So let's take a look at a couple of similar pedals. The Boss Super Overdrive, which will represent our Tube Screamer clipping diode class of pedals. This one is simply asymmetric clipping instead of symmetrical clipping that you'd see in Tube Screamers, which, by the way, this also has some asymmetric clipping qualities. Then we have a Proco Rat clone in the form of the Mosky Black Rat Distortion. I've got it on the vintage mode for this demo, which is more like your classic Rat or 2.0, not the turbo mode. And what's interesting is these are both clipping pedals, right? I mean, you've got a kind of a passive output volume for your boost section, or lack of boost if you want to roll off volume. You've got distortion for dirt. You've got tone and filter controls, which are situated in different places and certainly have a different overall effect. But in general, you're rolling off or accentuating more high end. But with the distortion, it's kind of a different beast. So there's only so many ways that you can get a audibly nice distortion sound, and it's really about where you place clipping diodes in the signal chain. For your run-of-the-mill Tube Screamer lookalike, those clipping diodes are placed in the feedback portion of an operational amplifier, while on a hard clipping pedal like this, the diodes are placed in the output section of the op amp. And so you get a much grainier, much softer distortion quality with something like this, even in the asymmetrical setup, versus a hard clipping pedal like this, or the MXR Distortion Plus, or the mini pedals that came after it. Now, the funny thing about the OCD is that it actually mirrors a hard clipping pedal like this in terms of its circuit design more, but the overall sound quality sits somewhere between the two. And in fact, I would say on the lower side of the drive control, it actually sounds more like one of these. That's because in addition to one diode that the OCD uses in this grounded output section, there's a pair of transistors, which, to my ears at least, the more drive you give it, sounds incredibly amp, incredibly tube-like. Although in the lower, say half of your gain or drive control, it doesn't sound all that different from something like an asymmetrical clipping diode pedal. And so for me, at least, this sits sort of perfectly in between these two in terms of its sound signature, while having a really open, not compressed at all kind of sound signature. And there's nothing wrong with that, with your run-of-the-mill hard clipping pedal. For me, though, this is like bordering on fuzz, what I would like with an artificial kind of distortion, whereas this, I think a lot of people could be easily fooled into thinking this is another amplifier channel. It is that open, it is that organic and amp-like. I apologize for saying that over and over, but I really think it perfectly describes this pedal. So let's have a listen to a short clip of these compared. As you'll hear, there's some spots where these sound damn near identical, but it's really when you start cranking the gain where you hear, okay, this thing has a very particular sound signature compared to this. And for me, at least, if I had to pick one pedal to do all of the jobs demonstrated in that clip, probably going to be the OCD. So you can hear the gain structure of the OCD behaves sort of like a tube amp. Even the output waveform looks very much like a mid-gain amp in action. Now the question is, how is the frequency response affected by each control, and how is the output level in general? Because that's one of the things that separates a lot of the pedals that we look at on this show. So let's start with one of my patented Microsoft PowerPoint Office Suite graphs here. Taking a look at the output level versus the volume control and the HP-LP switch. We'll discuss this a little bit more in depth in a moment, but for now, let's focus on the overall trends of this graph, which are really twofold. The first thing you should notice is that for all of these output levels here, the frequency response does one of these. So that means we're getting both a mild low cut and a high cut, which is extremely important when you're adding any sort of dirt. Otherwise, if you turn up a lot of distortion with a completely flat frequency response going into a clean amplifier, or especially a dirty amplifier, then things can sound really shrill and ice picky on the high end and really fat and fuzzy and not pleasant on the low end. But you have this gentle roll off that's just ever so slightly mid-focus, sort of a first order filter of sorts. And it sounds flat to our ears. It sounds like nothing's really changed. So I find that's why when you engage this pedal on especially lower drive control settings, that it just kind of sounds like you've added a little bit more oomph to your signal and not really any dirt, which is perfect. That's exactly what a transparent kind of overdrive needs to do. The second thing you'll notice is that for all but the lowest settings, you're getting a significant boost to your output volume. This is not, another case of the Blues Breakers where there's only like a very slim range where you're actually getting boost. As you'll notice here, both on the LP and HP settings with the volume all the way to max, and keep in mind this is drive at noon, so we could technically go a little higher, you're getting well over 10-12 decibels on a majority of the frequency output. So you will definitely hear that there's a big volume boost, and that's why even on clean settings, you'll see I've got this rolled back quite a bit a lot of the times. This is not quite as ridiculous as like the Klon I find, but it is rather close. And that brings us to the HP LP switch, and this graph makes things a bit more digestible compared to some of the later ones. You'll probably notice the overall shape between the same volume levels. So if we look at the orange and blue line there at the bottom, they're relatively the same, but what happens is they start basically completely parallel to one another within like half a decibel before they start to diverge around 100 to 200 hertz, and then they stay kind of a constant 3-4 decibel gap. So basically, LP is ever so slightly more bass focused and lower output, while HP is basically everything else focused with a bit more output. This kind of comes into a later part of the tone stack. It enables another resistor in parallel. Pretty simple trick, but it does have a pretty profound overall sonic effect. So I've seen a lot of people that just swear by one of these positions. I highly encourage that if you pick up one of these pedals, try both of them out, because I've found, depending on the amplifier, one can be useless and the other one can be magic. Or if you're trying to have kind of a more neutral flat boost, then maybe LP will do it for you, and HP if you're going for a, louder plexi kind of thing. It just depends. They're both there for a reason though, and that is why. Moving on to the drive control then, a really interesting thing happens when you move this potentiometer clockwise. In general, with a pedal like this, the frequency response stays flat, but the more you turn up drive, it kind of gains wings, as I would call it, where that really focused, 700 to 1000 hertz hump kind of starts to swell a little bit. It becomes less focused, and what you hear is a bit more oomph in the bottom end, and a lot of that treble content isn't really noticeable. But when it comes to the OCD, when you have gain minimized, it actually has a bit of a treble focused, or at least high mids. And that's why I find if you want to make this kind of a clean boost, it does work rather well when you minimize drive and you turn up volume. This is the same phenomenon no matter if you're on LP or HP, though as you can see, HP is once again a little lower output as well as more bass focused. Now, once you start turning up the drive control, here we're at about noon, then things kind of even off and we're looking at a more, flat 700 hertz focused frequency response, if that. And in fact, you even have just a ever so slight boost to some of those lower frequencies. It's rather, again, transparent at this point where it doesn't sound like you've thrown on a huge low pass or high pass or anything. However, once you start turning up the drive even further, you get a really big bass boost. And this is something that I'm not crazy about this pedal with, is everything past about 1 o'clock sounds a little woofy to me. Now, you can counteract that with a tone control, and if you've got a really stringy, thin amplifier, then that's a good thing. But this is one of the features on this pedal where I'd kind of like to see maybe a flatter frequency response overall, not just when this is at drive, noon or lower. So that's one thing to keep in mind, but it is a kind of an unusual side effect that we don't see on drive pedals like this. The story is similar with the tone control, except in reverse order this time. With tone minimize, we get a huge accent to the 200 to 300 hertz range. So if you want to counteract that big spike you get with drive minimize, then that's a good way to keep it more neutral. In general, I find this to be most useful around 10 o'clock forward, just to kind of get a little bit of that grit, if that's what you're looking for an overdrive sound at least. Again, tone at noon, relatively flat with just a touch of gain in those lower mids. And then as we max out the gain, we're looking at a very gentle boost to that, 1.6K region and a little higher. But of course, the frequency response is once again decimated after about 3K, which again is fine for a raw guitar DI because there's not a whole lot there anyway. And in some cases, I honestly think this could be a little bit more aggressive and probably get by with it fine. But for a pedal like this, it's kind of what you're looking for. So what you'll probably see is that I naturally turn up tone the more I turn up drive. Something that, kind of gets baked into your workflow with this pedal. But this setting is going to be super bright and brittle. This setting is going to be dark and practically unusable. But if you kind of follow them together and find that relationship, then you can make this thing stay really flat throughout all of its drive settings, and then throwing on more volume as you need it. So that's kind of how I approach this throughout all the use cases for the OCD. And I suppose that brings me to the handful of really nice settings that I found while working with this pedal. Overall, I think this does a great job as kind of a low to mid gain crunch sound. If you're working with a pedal platform, this is one I would definitely use for that. It works really well as a boost platform. So if you want to stack a pedal in front of this, this takes pedals like a champ. This can boost other things really well, but I find its amplifier-like nature, or at least preamplifier channel nature, makes it more suitable to kind of being one of the last things in your signal chain as far as dirt boxes go. So with that, let's talk about a couple of them, starting with sort of a touch of dirt, low gain kind of sound. So for me, this would be turning an American clean channel, or really compressed, kind of scooped out, sparkly clean kind of amplifier into something that's more like a Plexi normal channel, or a JTM 45, or even a Vox, or kind of a more mid-focused lo-fi sound, if you will, with more higher-end harmonics. And of course, you can adjust the tone to your desires, depending on how the amp is reacting. But there's a touch of dirt here, and you can make an amplifier really come to life. Some pedals out there sort of just sound like themselves no matter what you do to them, very much like some amplifiers do. This is not one of those pedals. Depending on what guitar you're using, what pickup configuration, it reacts in a very noticeable way. It does not muddy up those differences. And that's why the next use case of what I would call the P90 Plexi in a box is very compelling for me. Using humbuckers through this sounds great, of course, and I think it especially benefits from having something to kind of control the low end. But a single coil equipped guitar, especially a P90 derivative, and probably even Jazzmaster pickups, if I had to wager, have a very iconic sound through this. It's just like instantaneous classic rock. This has just that like boosted Vox or treble booster through a Plexi derivative kind of sound. It's pretty brilliant. So if you're playing a cover band, or you're into rockabilly or southern rock or classic rock or anything that has kind of those tones surrounding it, this might be a relatively inexpensive way to achieve those sounds. And it's something that, with one switch, you're back to American cleans. One of the less common use cases of the OCD is to make this your metal tube screamer replacement. You know, your stereotypical high level, low drive, maybe meet in the middle there, tone almost to max or at least past noon. You know, now you got a crunch machine, a gent machine in a box. And there's a good reason for that. Number one, I think it squanders a lot of the potential of the OCD. I think you're far better getting a less capable pedal to do that role and then saving this for something a little bit more exciting. But number two, no matter where you have this pedal set to, it's extremely flat, as we've shown, compared to something like this, which is not what you want for that application. Number two, the gain structure is such that there's always this chunk there, a really fat, saturated pick attack, which is awesome in so many use cases. I love it. But you know, if you're going for a really concise, boosted 5150 dual rect kind of pick attack, then that's probably not what you want. But I could think of some more contemporary, you know, hardcore alternative rock kind of sounds where this could probably work really well. It's not up my alley in particular, but you know, it's again kind of squandering some potential here. But if you already have an amp like this that for the most part does not need a whole lot of help to begin with, you could probably use this as that clean boost kind of application. But I'll show you something in between to prove that this can do hard rock and metal if you want to use it as that sort of clean boost. But again, I say try some of the other stuff on the list first. Earlier in the video, I recommended you use the OCD as your last or near last dirt pedal in your signal chain because it just sort of works like a preamp channel the way you would expect, whether you're boosting it with you know, another dirt box or a tube screamer or a fuzz pedal or even a clean boost. It just kind of sounds how you would expect an amp to sound. And that's proven here with this mid boost use case. So taking a plain graphic EQ, rolling off on the bass frequencies, gently cutting everything after about 800 hertz and boosting the level to compensate. And it sounds like a, you know, chunky, high gain, hard rock or metal amp at that point. It has the palm mute saturation and articulation that you would expect. And I think that if you're going to use the OCD in a high gain application, this is the way to use it. Kind of make this your tube-like gain stage in front of a crunchy or clean amplifier, and then use something else in front of it to bring out the parts that you want to. Because again, this is so transparent, it is so reactive and dynamic, depending on the signal you're giving it, that I think it's well worth the effort to use something else to change the sound of it. Now, some people might hear that and think, well, that's kind of pointless, spending that much money on a pedal and having to use something else. But again, it's kind of the philosophy behind a drive pedal like this. I view this very differently than something like a Klon or something like a Tube Screamer, where this is more like a modifier, almost like installing another gain stage in your amp, whereas this is purely for the gent, if you're going to set it up like this, or, you know, if you want to set it up in the effects loop and you want to cut this frequency, boost that one, then it has a different job. But it's all about how you view these sort of things. But to me, that's what this pedal excels at. conclusion then, the OCD is a bit of a tough nut to crack, and that's just considering this specific pedal, because there are like 9 or 10 other versions, and I can't promise you that they sound the same as mine, especially considering pedal-to-pedal variants, but you know, with other models that supposedly have a little different gain structure, a little more compressed, a little less headroom, whatever, this might be one of those pedals that is worth your while to wait and try in person. And if you don't like it, try another version, or try maybe the MOSFET drive from Fulltone or something else. So to say that there is a definitive OCD is probably really challenging, and I'm definitely not going to be the one to do so. Some other weird things about this to keep in mind. Later versions did correct the output impedance, but this one I think is only like 330K. I never had any issues with it. I put a buffer before and after. It sounds the same pretty much to my ears, so I didn't even bother mentioning it. It's not like a 10K fuzz pedal or treble booster that like completely destroys your guitar tone if you use it differently, but something to consider, and it's ultimately why I say just use this like damn near last, and it's not something you got to worry about too much. When it comes to the transparent overdrive legacy though, with stuff like the Bluesbreaker or the Klon or the stuff that came before it and after it, strictly talking about the baseline circuits, I think I might have to choose this one as my favorite. I think there's some iterations of the aforementioned pedals that do have a leg up on the OCD, but this one is just kind of like a blank canvas. I don't feel bad using this as, you know, just a slight gritty mid-gain boost, or using it as a distortion platform to use other pedals in front of, whereas with like a Bluesbreaker or even a Klon or you know, hell, even some clean boost, I kind of feel like I got to use them a certain way because they have that sound, and I kind of don't want to throw 3 other pedals in front of it to marauder that sound. Whereas OCD, yes, it does have kind of a baked-in British rock in a box kind of tone, but depending on what you pair it with, not really. And for that reason, I don't feel bad kind of pretending this is an extra couple preamp tubes or, you know, a different channel on your amplifier. And that's why I think whether you're into, you know, progressive metal or classic rock all the way to country, there's a pretty good chance this could get along with your pedal setup. Again, if you're playing balls to the wall heavy metal and you just want to boost a dual rectifier, then yeah, probably not. But I can say with almost absolute certainty, I want to use this on an upcoming project as kind of a fill-in for an amplifier, either like this or that amplifier exactly, because this does help transform some of those brittle, boomy amps into just guitar playing heaven, as far as I'm concerned. To go over some quick plans for the near future, I intend to wrap up this season, I guess you could call it, of Pedalhead with a comparative shootout next month or the month after, featuring basically all the stop boxes we've looked at up until this point, and even a couple that we've indirectly mentioned or, you know, featured, like the Rat and the Klon and stuff that hasn't been like the showcase of that video. But we'll go over those, kind of show how I think they excel versus one another, where their weak spots are, and generally give a wrap up and a send off to this very dirt pedal centric last few months of Pedalhead, before probably give it a rest for a little while and then move on to another angle, whether it be modulation, echo pedals, I don't know yet. We'll just have to see what I'm into at the time. But with that, any questions, comments, as always, please leave them down below. And thank you so much for watching. Bye.